That's Livin.
Yeah.
The story of Zora Neale Hurston. The Zora Neale Hurston story, right?
Right.
So, the cast. Zora Neale Hurston herself, you get to see it through stock footage, writings.
Yeah.
And then there's a young woman named Karen Stevens. She portrays Zora Neale Hurston. She does the reenactments.
Yeah.
It comes from a play that was put on back in '08.
Yeah.
But she does the reenactments, and in between them telling you the facts and showing you the images and having her act out Zora Neale Hurston, this is a beautiful piece.
It is.
Matter of fact, her niece is also in the film. She opens the film. Matter of fact, you hear her talking within the trailer, right? Richard Fitzpatrick, he plays Henry, the storyteller. So what you learn about Zora Neale Hurston in this story is that her father was the mayor of an all-black town in Florida. He was married to her mother. Zora Neale Hurston was the only child. The mother passes, right?
Yeah.
And then the father remarries. And that's as far as we're going to go right there with that, right? But in between time, she would go to the general store,
right,
and she would sit there where the men would tell stories, would tell stories of what was happening in the town, and she would sit there and she would listen and take in the language of the people in the town. She would take in the stories, and she retained these stories, right? And this interest in storytelling. So that's where Henry the storyteller is very intricate in this story, and you see this played out in reenactments, right? And as Zora began to grow, after her mother passed, she was a teenager at that time, right? And her mother passed, her father remarried, and something happens, and she has to go out on her own. And that's what we'll say with that. And let's go through the synopsis, right? The hashtag TFR Podcast Live synopsis, right? While working for the WPA, that's Works Progress Administration, Federal Theater Project in NYC 1935 through 1936, and the FWP, Federal Writers Program in Florida in 1938, Zora Neale Hurston produced works of fiction in the authentic voices of the people she surveyed, right? So she was able, because the WPA and the FWP that basically paid for her travel, for her to not only record the dialects but also film. You see her actual footage for the FWP and the WPA in this. It's very interesting how Zora Neale Hurston was able to pick up and not only use her affluent nature. Her affluent nature came through being hired by these companies that saw her ability to write, right? And they hired her to do this, to film as well as take photos. But what set her apart compared to her Caucasian counterparts is she could immerse herself into the culture and take part in the culture because she was a black woman, right? And most of these cultures that they wanted to record before regentrification happened, because regentrification keeps happening, people. As you go through and you research history, you find out regentification kept happening.
Right.
It keeps happening. It's just called something else at different times, right? But so before they're moved out and they no longer exist and that culture is lost, WPA and the FWP make sure that they capture these. So she was able to immerse herself in some of her greatest works.
Right.
Her greatest novels of fiction came from out of her experiences immersing in the people and creating a fictitious novel, a fictitious story that had a point about the existence of American black people or the various cultures of black people in America at that time in the 1930s, right? So it's very interesting to see what happens. But then there's something that happens that derails her upward mobility.
Yeah, which is frustrating.
It's very frustrating because, you know, they plastered it on the front page, right? But when it was found out not to be true, it was just a little retraction on the last page of the newspaper. Bottom of page 6. Oh yeah, by the way, this really didn't happen, but by that time it was too late and people didn't hear it, and guess who did it to her?
It affected her career.
But guess who did it to her though? Her own. But you have to watch the documentary. It is really well good. Worth watching.
Right.
That's Livin, right? The Zora Neale Hurston story. And do you know at the end of her life, she was substitute teaching, I tell that much. And the people didn't even know who she was. All black community didn't know who she was. But you have to watch it because they gave her top honor at the end of her life, right? She was broke at the end of her life after all of those successes, right? So let's break through. It's well worth watching to see how it is. And I always tell people all the time, you know, my mom always used to tell me, don't be around children. That's what she always said. If it's not your own, don't be around them. That's what we'll say about that. That'll give you a hint to it,
But you know what I was thinking after we watched the documentary, I thought about how millions of dollars was made because of the book she wrote after, she passed. So, but it's just like her brilliance and all of her writings, and we all grew up in school. Well, I guess it depends, because I heard some schools don't have Black history classes, but most grew up learning about her, right?
But they never told this.
Yeah, but you just assume that because she was such a great writer that she made money off of her writing. I mean, that she was comfortable. Right. Because like I said, once she died, they made millions off of her.
I'm saying, I'm wondering, does she have a trust or a foundation? Or
because she didn't have any children.
Right.
So it's just like, it was a really good documentary.
Yes, well worth watching. So let's go through the breakdown of the documentary. Okay. Cinematography. The use of the movement of the camera, introducing her niece, her great niece, Lucy Ann Hurston. Now, it's real interesting to see that people have family, right? Like, we were just watching the last episode of The Good Yardbird. Right?
Excellent.
And come to find out, George Washington had a nephew, a great nephew that really didn't amount to a hill of beans. And that definitely does show you the sins of the father will be visited upon the family. That's what I would say to that, right? He definitely didn't stand up. If Washington was one thing, he surely was not as depicted.
The nephew was depicted as a coward, very cowardly, the opposite of what his uncle was known to be.
Right. So, cinematography is a 10. The use of images, introducing again her niece, and using the story to retell the story. The use of stage props, of stage actors to retell the reenactments. Beautifully shot, beautifully lit. Sound and edits. The sound and the edits, because you had to go through actually hearing Zora's voice, some of the actual recordings that she did of the people, some of the images of the people that she surveyed, right? And cutting in between people who knew her, and you know, that's a 10. Storyline, through line. The storyline from her being a child and wanting to jump for the sun, you'll see where that reference comes from. That's a 10. Character arc, going from where she was to her as a teenager, to having to get on her own, arcing into who she was as a successful person, to being able to still keep her head up even in certain uncertainty. That's a 10. Empathy build. Does this documentary build empathy for Zora Neale Hurston? Right. Wardrobe and sets. I believe that the staging of the sets, it was believable.
It was believable.
You sit there and believe it. I do say that one of the scenes was the storytelling scene where you see Henry the storyteller. I think for film, unlike stage, it was a little too long. It was a little too long, or it should have had a third camera. It had two angles, should have had a third, and cut to a conversation that was happening in the pantry area or in the kitchen area of the general store.
But as an adult, her friends were there for her. Like, they helped her even with this scandal that wasn't true. Her friends made sure that she made it through. She had some place to live. She had another job. And I mean, I'm talking about throughout different states. This wasn't just in one city. Like, she had friends who loved her, who lived across the United States of America, and if she needed something, she was able to jump to another state and they would have a job for her. And it was saddening to find out how some people would try to take advantage of her.
Too, on the other side.
Right. You know, they would take advantage of her. They knew, they knew who she was, a talented writer. She was just, you know, in her right, she was successful. Financially, she may not have been, because they screwed her over on her money too, right? So this is a well done documentary, and I was sad, you know, because it's just the same damn story.
Same damn story. But you know what?
People being taken advantage of and used and not paid their worth. Or how about when you watch the documentary, she was hired to do something and she did it and they didn't pay her.
Yeah.
They didn't pay her money.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, so it's the same story. But I will say this. This is what I was a little bit disturbed by. So let me say, I researched and it said 4 books. And then it said, someone else said at least 6 books she had, right? But when they took her down, with this false accusation, she was working on her either 5th or 7th book, and she was going to have 3 or 4 more afterwards that kept getting, well, you'll watch the documentary and see. So that's Livin, the Zora Neale Hurston story. I give that a 10.